Good day, everyone. Welcome to Hume 39. This is still your ethics course, and today we will be doing our discussion on our next lecture, which is all about the ethics of sentiment, reason, and courage. At the outset, let me just remind you that I hope that you are not um, confused with the jargons that we are using in this class, because even though philosophy has their own jargons, what is important, at least for you to do, is just to make sure that we understand the meaning behind the jargons or the words that we will be using. With that, again, ito po si Sir E at your service, and we will now be starting with our discussion again on the ethics of sentiment, reason, and courage. And part of the topics that we will be covering today are the following. Letter A, we will be discussing on the concept of sentiment and moral decision making. Another is we'll be discussing the concept of feelings and reason. Also, we will look at the moral impetus of impartiality, and we will look at the seven-step guide to moral reasoning. Also, we will look at moral courage, vice, and virtue. And we will look at physical and moral courage and the moral imperative of the will. We will be discussing these topics with the following learning objectives in mind. First one, we will establish the role sentiment or feelings or emotions, reason, and courage play in ethical and moral decision making. Also, we'll try to elaborate on the philosophical ideas that strengthen sentiment, reason, and courage and their link to morality and ethics. Also, we will outline the significance of sentiment when making moral and ethical valuations, just the same that we will be outlining the significance of reason and also of the will when making moral and ethical valuations. And lastly, we will try to define courage and specify the nuances between its two classifications, which are physical and moral courage. Once again, this is Hume 39, and our topic for today is the ethics of sentiment, feelings or emotions, reason, and courage. And again, I am your lecturer today. This is Sir E. And so, during the 18th century, the Scottish philosopher David Hume, in his work, A Treatise of Human Nature, okay, furthered the idea that when we talk about morality, it is solely based not on reason but on emotions, meaning that when you talk about the concept of what is right and wrong, at least according to David Hume, we do not have to look at the concept of right and wrong based on what we think is right. It's not all about thinking what is right and wrong, but it's all about feeling what is right and wrong. Because for him, at least according to his book, A Treatise of Human Nature, the concept of right and wrong, that is the concept of morality, is based solely on our emotions and never about our feelings. And he said this due to the following reason. Number one, reason alone, according to Hume, cannot be a motive to the will. Hindi daw po pwedeng maging motibo ng ating pagnanais gawin ng isang bagay ang ating pag-iisip, kung hindi the motive of our will is actually the reason in itself is a slave of passion. For him, then, when we speak of reason, this is supposed to be a slave of our emotions. And also, according to David Hume, when we talk about moral distinctions, these are not derived from reason. Hindi tayo makakahanap at hindi natin malalaman kung ano ang tama at mali sa pamamagitan lamang ng kung ano ang nakikita natin sa ating isipan. Number three, moral distinctions, according to Hume, are derived from moral sentiments. That is, yung pakiramdam or yung ating feelings of approval. Say, when you say approval, you talk about esteem and praise, and disapproval. These are felt by spectators who contemplate a character trait or action by the use of their emotions. Now, for him also, while some virtues and vices are natural, at least according to him, when we talk about the concept of justice, it is very much artificial because this concept of justice is solely all about the reasonability of man, and it is not even looking at what man could actually feel. Now, the way Hume sees it, the reliance on reason alone simply cannot suffice when making moral evaluations. Meaning, for him, when you talk about the concept of reason, our thinking, okay, it could not be the basis of what is right and what is wrong, and using our reasonability could not give us the idea of what is right and what is wrong, because for him sentiments serve as the true grounding principle of morality. And here, when we talk about our emotions, when we talk about our feelings, this is when we discover the truth. Now, according to RM here, Hume's law, okay, advances the thought that when we talk about a moral imperative, when we say imperative, this is necessary or an ought, cannot proceed from an is or a mere factual observation. Okay, now when we talk about these concepts, we have to understand that a rational person is completely different from a moral one, because rationality in and of itself is not automatically equivalent to morality. So what is stated here is that even though you think that you are reasonable, that does not make you a moral one. Okay, so even though you say, okay, this is the rational thing to do, that doesn't mean that it's the moral thing to do. Just the same, it is not equivalent. So how do we make sense of these? So here in the screen right now, you see a picture of a robber, a bank robber, and a policeman. Now, both of these two are rational in that they employ proper reasoning in accomplishing their objectives. Now, the objective of the bank robber is to rob money from the bank, while the objective of the policeman is actually what? To execute the law, okay, be it apprehending outlaws, okay, and whatnot. Now, but for obvious reasons, even though they have their reasonability or reasoning in doing their things, it doesn't necessarily follow that both of them are moral. Okay, in other words, when we talk about the morality of an individual, it is not inclusive in the reasonability of an individual. According to Hume, again, reason only strives to determine truths present in the external realities of objects. So, what you see is what you get. For him, reason only informs us about what transpired, but it doesn't necessarily tell us the morality of what transpired. Now, there is no such thing as an objective moral truth. According to him, only subjective moral judgments anchored on feelings. Meaning, when you talk about moral judgments, all of these judgments are very much subjective because they are all anchored on what we feel, on our emotions, on our sentiments, and whatnot. However, this idea of David Hume was in total opposition of what Immanuel Kant was actually espousing. Because for Immanuel Kant, for him, man as a moral agent can only attain virtue if feelings play no significant role in making decisions. So you see here the concept of morality, at least from the perspective of Immanuel Kant, is totally different from what David Hume is saying. Okay, for David Hume, feelings has no what? Okay, feelings is the only way in order for us to understand what is right and what is wrong. However, for Immanuel Kant, feelings play no significant role in making decisions. It's only supposed to be reason. Okay? For Kant, man's moral agency can only be perfected if decisions are based solely on the reasonability of man, and we do not include our emotions, our feelings, because for Kant, when we talk about our emotions, okay, our feelings, these for him is seen as an enemy of virtue. Okay. However, another philosopher by the name of Ronald de Sousa would suggest that feelings and reason should not be antagonistic with each other because for him, feelings and reason are supposed to be complementing each other. Emotions for him can be considered rational. Okay? For him, there is a logical need in man to communicate emotional expressions. He advanced that the function of emotions is to fill in the gaps left by pure reason. And according to de Sousa, if man is without feelings, okay, and he will only use the reasonability of himself, he has a tendency to become a Kantian monster. When you say Kantian monster, this was actually named after Immanuel Kant. When you speak of a Kantian monster, you become a Kantian monster when you are solely siding on reason alone. However, heart overhead types can also do more harm than good when making decisions, for their emotions often supersede rational thought. That's the reason why, at least for De Sosa, there has to be a complement between what we feel and what we think. Because again, when you talk about emotions, these are actually filling the gaps left by pure reason. And so, according to Stanislaw Jerzy Lek, when we talk about the concept of impartiality is not all about neutrality. It's all about partiality for what is right. It is partiality for what we deemed as just. Again, when we speak of impartiality, it is not neutrality, it is partiality for justice, which now will bring us to our idea or understanding of the concept of cognitive dissonance. It's just like people believe in so many things. However, when there are facts presented to them and these facts are right down true, even though they are presented with facts, they will hold on to what they previously believe. And this is the moment when they experience what we call as cognitive dissonance. And when we say cognitive dissonance, this is a mental conflict which occurs when a belief or assumption is contradicted by new information. Okay, so when these people are uh, faced with new facts and whatnot, they would be feeling uncomfortable, and somehow they would tend to rationalize. They would shy away from from the truth. They will deny everything that doesn't fit with their core belief. Okay, so this is what you call the concept of cognitive dissonance, and cognitive dissonance somehow has um led to the concept of prejudice, at least in history. Now, when you talk about prejudice, this is an intrinsic flaw in human thought. So in order to give intact the moral soundness of a decision, one must pay heed to facts in order for a person to be not prejudiced at all. Though there is a question here: how do we exactly know or ascertain if something is factual or not? Unfortunately, there is no fixed formula in doing so, though facts nevertheless act as a shield against potent emotional appeals designed to either change or further reinforce one's opinion. Take, for example, the case of those who suffered leprosy during the Middle Ages. Those who suffered from this disease, formerly called as Hansen's disease, were expelled from the mainstream society back in the Middle Ages, and they resettled in what is now known as leper colonies due to the unfounded belief that leprosy is incurable and that it is contagious, nakakahawa. The heavy physical disfigurement of the sufferers proved enough to frighten people, despite there were scientific evidences pointing that when you talk about leprosy, it is not really incurable and that it does not really spread fast. However, there still were people who refused to accept the fact that leprosy is not contagious. Okay? And so they become prejudiced to people who are lepers. They became partial with them. So when we talk about the concept of reason and impartiality, okay, when we speak of these concepts, reason and impartiality, as guided by sound judgment, can be reliable tools in bypassing the subjectivity of feelings. Okay, so here see how the emotions or the sentiments of men, which sometimes distract from making the right decisions, can be what? Okay, can be complemented by the idea of reason and impartiality. However, when we talk about reason and impartiality, it has to be guided by sound judgment. But how do they relate to the concept of morality? And so now we look at the concept of the moral impetus of impartiality. Now, using complexion, when we talk about complexion, we talk about skin color and whatnot. Using complexion or skin color, say, or a sexual preference and religious orientation for that matter, as guiding principle when making moral evaluations, okay, on people is not only invalid but also morally indefensible. Back in the antebellum era, the period in the South America, in American South, leading up to the Civil War, where you see a lot of racism. You talk about the enslavement of black people during that time. It was not only a norm at that time, but it was a lucrative industry. It's one historical example of when moral impartiality was not properly served because of the discrimination that the black people during that time was experiencing. If you're going to look at the other picture on your screen right now, you will also see that during the time of the Spanish colonial rule in the Philippines, there were in the social strata what we call as the Indios, okay? And these were the natives who were discriminated against mainly due to their inferior physical appearance and their perceived laziness, which of course doesn't have any evidence at all. And so let's talk about the reason in impartiality, at least in the US, by virtue of the First Amendment Defense Act. Now, the so-called First Amendment Defense Act was introduced in the United States, okay, in 2015 by a senator and a representative of the US. Now, this bill, if passed into a law, will protect people who will take action against others on the basis that they act in accordance with a religious belief or a moral conviction from being what? From being penalized by the federal government, by the state. Okay? Its scope will cover acts of discrimination committed against the third sex on the premise that what? Number one, these are the premises of the FADA or the First Amendment Defense Act. First, marriage is to be recognized as the union of a man and a woman. And the second premise is this, that sexual relations are properly reserved for such marriage, in that it is only for both men and women. Okay? Now, when you talk about this one, the question here is this First Amendment Defense Act, is this bill morally actually impartial? The question here is this, is FADA legislating hate against the LGBTQ community, or it's just protecting people from being discriminated for standing up for their religious beliefs? Say, for example, if you are an owner of a bake shop and then here's this couple who would want for you to bake their wedding cake. However, your couple are actually same sex. And so, if in case you would refuse, okay, to bake their wedding cake because you believe, okay, that you are just acting based on what you think is right according to your religious truth, then you will not be penalized by the federal government. And here lies the question. If this is legalized in the state, would it just legislate hate against the LGBTQ community? Or, on the other hand, is it just protecting people from being discriminated for standing up for their religious beliefs? And so now this will lead us into Michael Davis's 7-step guide to moral reasoning. For him, for us to be able to know what is right and wrong, he's trying to guide us into these 7 steps for us to figure out what is right and what is actually wrong. Okay. The first step, according to Michael Davis, is you have to look at the moral dilemma. What is the dilemma? What is the problem? That is stating the problem. The second is that you try to check and observe facts. You try to look at it, and then you try to identify the relevant factors, the agencies or the actors, okay, surrounding the dilemma, and then you develop a list of options. But what Michael Davis tried to zero in on the 7-step guide to moral reasoning is the fifth step, which is all about the testing of the options. And his testing of the options, you will see here a lot because there are a lot of tests, okay, that Michael Davis gave to us, at least on this side, okay. The first step, okay, in testing the option is what we call as the harm test. And here the question would be this one: would less harm be done on other people when I favor this decision over the other? So you talk about the good of the majority. So you talk about the harm test. The second one in the testing of the options is what we call as the defense of. Okay, the first one is the harm test, and the second one is this one. Okay, we talk about the publicity test. Okay, so when we make decisions, according to Michael Davis, if we already made the decision, would we be proud of that decision if in case a lot of people would find out, if in case it makes the evening news, or if in case your loved ones will find out about your decision, would you be proud of that decision? And that is the second in the testing of the options according to Michael Davis. The next one is what we call as the defensibility test. And here the question would be this one: I be able to defend this decision before the court or a panel or reviewers without appearing self-serving? Meaning, if in case you will be facing a lot of people who would ask you about your decision, would you defend it? Will you be able to defend it without, okay, without appearing that you are doing it for your own good? Okay, without appearing self-serving. The next one in the testing of the options is what we call as the reversibility test. And here, the questions are this: would I still prefer my option of choice if it were to have some adverse effects on me instead of others? The next question would be: would I still want it despite its implications? Say, for example, you are not going to be on the receiving end of your decision. Okay, but then again, that will change. Let's put it on reverse. You will be on the receiving end of your decision. Will you still be making that decision even though it would have an adverse effect on you by now? And that is what you call as the reversibility test. The next one in the testing of the options, still the fifth stage in Michael Davis' 7-step guide to moral reasoning, is what we call as the colleague test. And here the question is this: how would my profession's ethics committee see the option, or what would they say? Perhaps this is in the setting of an organization, or perhaps of a, say, in your company or whatnot. Okay, so ano kaya yung iisipin nila? Do you think that they would say that what you did was just right, or would you think that what would they say is that what you did is actually wrong? And then also we have the organization test, okay, which is a very very much hinged doon sa previous organization test, okay. the organization test here, you talk about this question: what would my company's or organization's ethics officials or legal counsel say regarding the option? So, medyo pareho ito doon sa previous na nakita nating testing option, which is the colleague test. Okay, so kanina sa colleague, yung mga katrabaho, yung ethics committee, and perhaps yung dito naman, yung sa may the entire company or the organization itself. The last one, which is the most important of all, is what we call as the virtue test. Okay, and when we talk about the virtue, it's not about other people, it's all about the kind of person that you are. Because here the questions are the following: what person would also choose such an option? Is he or she who someone might consider as virtuous? What would become of me if I enact this option all the time? So here in the testing of the options, at least according to Michael Davis, in the last testing of the options, it's all about the morality of an individual, acting based on what is right, making the person virtuous. Are the decisions that we are making us morally right? Is it actually complementing virtue in itself? Okay, and of course, after the fifth stage, you talk about coming up with a choice or decision based on the above mentioned. But the seventh step, okay, of Michael Davis does not necessarily follow that you immediately make a decision afterwards. Okay, so for him, the seventh step should be reviewing steps 1 to 6, so as to avoid mistakes in making decisions. Okay, so that we can prevent making bad decisions again. So we can see if there are precautions to take, what changes should be affected, if in case it would involve organization, or even if it's on a personal level or whatnot. Would it be possible to get more support if, in case, we will be making decisions on things as such? So these are the things that at least we have to consider in making moral decisions. And so this is the proper time to go into the concept of courage itself. And here, excuse me, we will be discussing about the concept of moral courage. Now, to thoroughly interrogate man's character, we should be raising the question: what is the good of man? Now, to answer this quite simplistically, we have to look at man's adherence to virtue. Aristotle made a very good definition of what virtue is when he said, when we speak of virtue, it is a character trait that manifests in the habitual performance of a set of cues. Let's look at the definition of Aristotle here. So he said that when we speak of virtue, it is a character trait that manifests in what? Habitual performance. Now, you see the word habitual here. It does not say that virtue is a character trait that manifests in the performance, a single performance of a behavioral cue. But for him, it has to be habitual, meaning it's once. It is a habit of a person doing it. Take, for example, a compassionate individual. A compassionate individual never demonstrates compassion only on occasion, for this is a defining and unchangeable aspect of his or her character. In other words, when you say that a person has compassion as his virtue, meaning he's compassionate all the time, not just once, not just twice, but it is a habit of that person to be compassionate. Okay? Now, the above definition of virtue, though relatively all encompassing, somehow is rather incomplete. Now, let's look here at the definition of Rachel's of what virtue is all about. And here he said that when we speak of virtue, it is a character trait manifested in what? The habitual action that is good for a person to have. This extends to moral virtues as well as courage included. But how do we define courage? When we say courage, it is that which sits between the extremes of cowardice and recklessness. The same way that when we speak of virtue, it sits between the idea of excess and deficiency. Okay? You are not courageous if you are coward, and you are not courageous if you are reckless. Okay? The same way that when we speak of virtue, you do not say that you are kind. When you are overly kind, when there is an excess of kindness, or when there is a deficiency of kindness. So, when we speak of courage, it resides at the nexus point of danger and endurance and can be classified as either physical courage or moral courage. Now, our understanding of the idea of conventional courage, okay, has a different idea when we talk about the concept of military virtue of courage. For we call it belligerence. That is, it is obviously a prerequisite in combat. In engaging an enemy, say on a physical level, there is an evident danger that only the absence of fear in man can hurdle. Military men were trained at least to do this. Now, when you talk about cowardice, on the other hand, it is either retreat or complete inaction in the face of adversity. If you see an adversity and you do not do anything about it at all, that is complete inaction and that is cowardice. Okay. However, when you talk about recklessness, that is immature risk taking. And in your youth, somehow there is a tendency to be reckless just because we tend to be too much idealistic of things. Now, let's continue now. When you talk about physical courage, it is the enactment of virtue through actual activity. However, when we speak of moral courage, it is never always demonstrated on entirely the physical level. Instead, when we speak of moral courage, when we speak of moral courage, it engages in such acts which serves mainly to further typify the virtues one live by. Take the case, for example, of champion boxer Muhammad Ali, known for his physical courage as an athlete. Of course, in 1987, of course, he's a renowned boxer. Okay, he will go down in history not just as a courageous boxer physically. Okay, in 1967, he was stripped off of his heavyweight title due to his refusal to be drafted in Vietnam War because for him he believed that the Vietnam War is actually an ideologically detestable war. He doesn't approve of the war at all. Remember that the Vietnam War took place during the Cold War, and in his activism as an offshoot of his perceived moral courage, it cost him his career during that time. But you have to understand that moral courage is not exclusive to larger than life figures in history like Muhammad Ali. Okay? It is also something that ordinary people like us can demonstrate, even in the most ordinary settings. When the world entered the 21st century, courage can be manifested and demonstrated on different levels. Courage as manifest virtue began to steadily depart from the trappings of war since we got no wars at the moment, where true courage can be found. And into the struggles of everyday life, suddenly everyone can be good actors, if I may say, courageous actors in their own moral dramas. Now let's look at the determinants of moral character. Now they say that the bystander effect is a determinant of moral courage. However, studies show that individuals tend to inhibit from helping others if there are people present. They will just look at one situation, and this psychological phenomenon we know now as what we call as the bystander effect. And in a study of Greitmeyer, Fisher, and Kastenmuller and Fry, they revealed that people respond to emergency situations where victims' safety are much evidently at stake. Kapag merong nag-aaway sa kanto, nagsisigawan lang, people would not necessarily act and help out. Okay? Pero kapag nagsimula na yung nagsabunutan or pag may nagsaksakan in those dire situations, those are the only moments that the courage of people will be aroused and they will try to help. So when we talk about the bystander effect, this is not a genuine determinant of moral courage. But what are the determinants of moral courage? Perhaps we can consider mood as a determinant of moral courage. Okay, it is said that people who are happy or in a very positive mood because are likely to help others because doing so is seen as a factor in prolonging it. Say, for example, when you are happy and you go back home and then you try to help your parents a lot, but when you are in a bad mood and you go back home, even if your parents would ask you to run errands for them, it's as if since you're in a very negative mood, you would not want to help them. So perhaps a very positive mood would be helping, okay, helpful in fostering courage itself. Mood plays an important role on whether a person chooses to demonstrate helping behavior. Furthermore, those in a neutral to negative mood state are also seen to augment their pro-social behavior because it is believed to counter bad mood. It was subsequently revealed that neither of the three moods, positive mood, negative mood, or neutral mood, affects one's capacity for moral courage in any way, as it varies depending on the situation. Meaning, if you're in a positive mood or a negative mood, or perhaps on a neutral mood. Some of the fostering factors of moral courage, perhaps the first one could be considered, is what we call as our social norms. And when we talk about norms, these are what again? These are the socially acceptable behavior of people in the society. When we say that these are the normative rules of the society, so these are the prescribed characterizations of how people should act in the society. Now, social norms are predominantly the most salient pro social ones in encouraging morally courageous acts, meaning our society dictates when one is supposed to be courageous and when one is not. It is in the norms which are deeply held in the traditions of the people. The other fostering factor of moral courage could be anger. And when we say anger as a fostering factor of moral courage, you have to understand that morally courageous acts are often caused by moral outrage or the kind of anger provoked by the violation, say, for example, of certain moral or ethical standard, or say the violation of human rights. Say, for example, during the 1986 People Power Revolution, Filipinos were angry, okay, because of the rampant human rights violation that was transpiring in the society at that time, pointing to a higher cause. And out of anger, they were able to topple dictatorship during that time. And so these will now lead us into understanding the three elements of moral courage, which are the following. We have danger, principles, and endurance. You wrap this up together, and this will result into what we know as moral courage. And also, in this topic of the ethics of sentiment, reason, and courage, we will be looking also at the idea of the moral imperative of the will. But it is very important first for us to understand the what do we mean when we talk about the will. Okay, we were given the free will, as they say. Okay, now will is the fortitude or the strength it takes for one to act or decide according to a personal set of principles. But how do they relate to morality? Okay, if you are, say, for example, on a diet and you are able to successfully shake thoughts of having that slice of pizza you were craving for all week, it can be said that your will is relatively strong. But in the field of philosophy, it is espoused in the ways that outline its relation to reason and morality. According again to Immanuel Kant in his book, The Critique of Practical Reasons, when we say will, it is the faculty man has. Okay? It is the faculty man has in order to act according to a conception of law. Okay? According to the conception of law. Take, for example, the case of Martin Luther King Jr. Okay, of course, he has no power, significant power over the success or failure of the civil rights movement, okay, which he started, okay, in the US. But does he has power over the will to lead the cause? In other words, it is through the motive behind the action that man's morality can be properly evaluated. Do you want to know whether a person is acting morally or not? You have to look at the motive of the will. Okay? Therefore, it is the initial enactment of his will not merely to conform to the law, but for the sake of the law that defines the moral courage of man, not the end result of it. What is the reason behind why we do what we do? And that is very important. To Kant, misfortunes and bad luck may prevent man, okay, from, okay, when we talk about, okay, let's go back to that slide for a moment, okay, according to Kant, okay, misfortunes and bad luck may prevent man from attaining his objectives, okay, but the unconditional goodness of the will, and when we talk about the unconditional goodness of the will, we talk about the idea of goodwill, okay, that's just goodwill. The unconditional goodness of the will, or simply put, goodwill, that guided his action remains. Precisely, will must be in the service of duty, meaning we are acting on our will on the basis of our duty and not on any impulses or not for any motives at all. That's the case. That's the reason why when we talk about the concept of altruism, which is defined as the concern for the welfare of others, it is never unconditionally good. So when we talk about altruism, it is never unconditionally good. Listen, altruism is okay because when you are altruistic, you are concerned for the welfare of others. However, how come that altruism is never unconditionally good? Because paradoxically, it is not always a sense of moral duty that inspires a selfless act, right? What sometimes inspires a selfless act is a selfish motive, meaning you are trying to help other people because of the praise, the approval, and the applause that one could get out of the altruistic deed that one is actually doing. The happiness man gets from helping others is not deserved and therefore not intrinsically good unless the motive is really good. Understand? Now, according to Immanuel Kant, still, flawed will. Okay, and when we talk about the flawed will of man in Christian philosophy, we say that the flawed will of man began during the conception of the original sin through the first creations of God. Now, when we talk about the flawed will, this is predominantly influenced by the impulses of human nature, making this freedom non-absolute. That's the reason why, at least when the original sin came to man, no matter how man tried to do what is right, we always are inclined to doing what is not right because of our flawed will. That's the reason why when we talk about the flawed will, freedom is definitely non absolute, especially if we try to compare that of the moral will, which is rooted primarily in duty and reason. Arthur Schopenhauer, according to him, when we talk about the will, okay, the ability of man to make the decision on his own volition is the key to all existence. That is what is according to Arthur Schopenhauer. Thus, for him, existence is actually will materialized, capable of generating all that is desirable and otherwise in this world. Now, according to St. Thomas Aquinas, will, as guided by intellect when desired, can be labeled as an appetite for reason. Now, will for him has to be guided by intellect, by reason. Okay? in order for it to be what? Okay, to be something that is actually good, to be somehow to be achieved by everyone. Now, according to Josiah Royce, however, consciousness is where knowing begins, and which itself is an act of the will. That's the reason why when you talk about the consciousness of people, you talk about the conscience of man, and that is where we try to understand and analyze what is right and what is wrong. For Royce, will in and of itself, without relation to intellect, it what is what guides man. So, as we try to wrap up our lesson on the ethics of sentiment, reason, and courage, here we tried to look at the important role that sentiment or our feelings play. Okay, as at least according to David Hume, in making moral valuations, we are able to discuss that, and so we were able to talk about the concept of impartiality and will, and we were able to look at Michael Davis's seven-step moral reasoning model as outlined in our discussion, as well as the moral and physical dimensions of courage. And that wraps up our discussion on the ethics of sentiment, reason, and courage. I hope that we are all able to learn from our discussion today. Again, this is Sir E, your lecturer in this class, and this has been Hume 39. Thank you very much, and hopefully you're able to learn and enjoy our lecture. Thank you very much again. This is Sir E now, signing off.